This is going to be a really interesting panel because manufacturing, logistics, and retail plays a huge, significant role in carbon and climate after agriculture, right? Like the two of them as industries make up about half of the equation as it relates to climate and climatic impact. And I think it's our biggest opportunity is in the first half of this entire session. So winning, but I'll let all of these guys introduce themselves.
Yeah, Ryan Carelli, VP of Sustainability here at Infor Nexus, which is kind of a company within Infor. We're a supply chain platform that helps connect suppliers to very large brands, Nike, Adidas, large manufacturers like Caterpillar. And this is not my job title. This is probably based off LinkedIn, which I never upped.
Yeah, Carlos Rojas. I lead the global manufacturing solutions practice at Cisco. I've been with the firm for about 18 years, building up that practice. What we do is we provide security and connectivity solutions to gather data and insights inside manufacturing and across the supply chain. And I currently, I used to work in the manufacturing sector, so total of 39 years of experience.
Kevin Richards, former director of the Bermuda Shipping and Maritime Authority. I'm now consulting with them to help them redevelop their ESG strategy and help connect with all of our industry colleagues around the world and help them to achieve their climate goals.
Hey everyone, Noah Lincoff, Director of Product at Mastercard for a variety of our digital assets and blockchain new products. Been working on supply chain traceability via blockchain for a while. For a while, it was a commercialized product we were running at Mastercard that I was doing BD for. It was called Mastercard Provenance. In a former life, also, I was a management consultant, did a variety of feasibility studies around blockchain for supply chain traceability for a number of organizations, World Wildlife Fund being a major one. One of the major things also that we're working on with our new products now is facilitating exchanges of assets that can be represented by digital assets. Carbon credits are a major focus for that. So I've been working with Triangle on potential use cases and looking forward to discussing those further here.
We have lots of different perspectives, same topic. So what different trends are you seeing from your industries?
Yeah, I mean, especially with retail manufacturing, it's just time to trace. You know, digital product passports are looking to get rolled out in the EU relatively soon. Our customers are concerned. In many cases, they do not have the data. They also they have not mapped out their supply chain and engaged with suppliers in the way that they need to. So the time to start working is now. We're seeing huge trends that way. And this, they're looking at it as a competitive advantage. We just heard document, consumers want to see better data about your carbon emissions on the products they buy, for example. Well, you can't really get that data very well if you don't actually know who's in your supply chain, if you haven't actually kind of captured along the way. So our customers are trying to, we call it going end tier with the supply chain. Right now, they have very good relationships with their direct suppliers, slightly worse with their suppliers and so on. But we want to make it a true business network where you can see across the whole chain.
Yeah, and picking up on the digital passport that Brian mentioned, particularly around large assets that are OEM manufacturers, they're being required to build essentially a playbook, a digital playbook of what they manufacture, and they call it digital twin in many cases. This becomes the traceability factor for then what things are happening in the EU. In Frankfurt, the Industrial Digital Twin Association has been formed around about 50 to 60 companies right now that make up about 20% of the total GDP in Germany. And what they do is they now use that digital twin as a baseline for measuring carbon emissions for the next set of productions of that particular product. And that, I think it's going to start to grow outside of Germany and into Europe. It should be a new standard inside the US as well. The other trends that we're seeing in the manufacturing space around internal monitoring of energy consumption. Believe it or not, a lot of manufacturers really don't have much visibility into their factory consumption beyond what is coming into the meter from the utility provider. And having been a previous manufacturing executive and monitored these things, a lot of automation is being purchased, but there's not a lot of insight into how much energy is being consumed at the point of use. And last but not least, people are looking to build in monitoring inside their in terms of emissions monitoring inside their products. So there's a lot of solutions around that as well.
I think in the shipping space, there's been a challenge in terms of adoption of some of the new technologies that have been attempted. I think TradeLens is the biggest example of efficiency technology solution that was put out by Maersk, and I think thought was going to transform the industry, and that sort of collapsed a few years ago. So I was chatting with the IBM leader who put that together, and it was a very disappointing outcome for the industry. So there's some very aggressive targets that the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, has set for carbon footprint reduction. I think 20 to 40% by 2030, and then 70 up to 70 to 80% by 2050 compared to 2008 levels. So you're seeing a lot of carbon credit purchasing. You're seeing new biofuels and different fuel sources being implemented into ships. But a lot of the companies around the world are really challenged to retrofit their existing vessels. And the new buildings, you're seeing a lot of new buildings that are implementing more efficient engines and different manufacturing techniques going into that. But there's a huge challenge for a lot of the shipping companies around the world to convert the existing fleets to hit these targets. So it's a really difficult time for the industry.
I think actually that leads into what I was going to talk about. One of the major challenges that we've seen, and this was 4 or 5 years ago, I think all the organizations that I worked with were, how does the technology work? How can we trace? Now it's getting more into how can we trust what's being traced? So there's a lot of challenges around meeting targets. A lot of targets have been imposed, whether it's climate targets or any other forms of reporting. But how to gather that data in a way that everyone can trust when that data is coming in from a variety of different sources. So sometimes I've heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out, right? So if we have a database that's tracing events that are occurring in a supply chain, for example, how do you know that those events are being recorded accurately? Is it with sensors that are being placed? Is it essentially a trust system that's requiring a variety of different actors who may not be incentivized to play honestly to gather that data? And when you're talking about major supply chains, global supply chains that may not have, as much regulatory oversight as you would hope for at every stage, how can you ensure that the data that's coming in doesn't allow that kind of dishonest behavior, especially when ambitious targets are in the mix that organizations are trying to meet? Or if there's incentivization types of structures, how do you make sure that those incentives aren't being gamed, essentially? So I think what we've seen is a much bigger push now to actually be able to trust that data. How do we know that we can trust it? Is it with a credentialing organization? Is it with sensor data? Is it with an actual insurance type of product being provided behind the traceability data? There's a lot of different things that have been explored there, but I think taking it to that level of something that everyone can actually get behind, and they're willing to be either a premium placed on that or a requirement placed on that, is one of the major trends that we've seen.
So it sounds like there's a general theme around regulations. And at this stage, it's also the European regulations are leading this space. Would you agree with that?
I would actually say, especially depending on your industry, for fashion, with cotton especially, UFLPA and the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act just clobbered that immediately. Kind of the US jumped out very quickly. We work with a lot of fashion customers. This is a big concern. We have customers who have their goods being detained in port today by Customs Border Patrol because they're being asked to prove that it didn't have cotton that came from the Uyghur Autonomous Region. So it's generally the EU always leads on this. And this is one of the surprising things where EU law moves very slowly and very methodically in probably a smart way. And sometimes with an executive order in the United States, you can create a law that has huge disruption. So today, that's the main focus of a lot of our customers, is making sure that they can actually prove that their goods were not sourced from Xinjiang, China. But tomorrow, looking forward, the requirements they have for the digital product passport in the EU and other laws coming out of there are far more stringent. So it requires them to step up their game even more.
Yeah, I think we see some variations and fluctuations in that depending on the administration that's in place. So, our current administration has enforced a lot of these traceability things in terms of the supply chain and raw material sourcing, and more stringently than in other administrations. So it kind of depends. But the EU does lead in the industrial side in terms of heavy industry, particularly in the automotive space, and also in a trend that I didn't mention around investing in alternative energy sources. So a lot of resistance in terms of capital investment for alternative energy and manufacturing is out there because generally speaking, with the exception of semiconductor and pharma, margins in manufacturing are pretty slim. So capital investment tends to go towards things like, hey, I need a new forklift, or, I need to build a new building, and not necessarily buy this windmill or solar panel. So it depends on what they're investing in.
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. In the maritime sector, the EU standards are more aggressive than what the IMO set out. The thing that I've been thinking about being based in Bermuda is the impact on our insurance industry. So we've got about 30% of the P&I clubs are based in Bermuda. And, when you look at scope 2, scope 3 impacts on, the people they're touching, the EU, then their policies have a very, very heavy hand on sort of how they report and where the data is coming from the insurance side. So it's something that you just can't ignore, no matter what. No matter where you sit in the value chain, you've really got to pay attention to what different regions are putting out there from a regulatory perspective.
And with 5 years left to hit that 2030 target, because it's really almost 5 years and a quarter away, where are those sustainable fuels going to come from? What's emerging right now that looks like it could be successful within that?
I mean, I think biofuels are leading the way. Hydrogen is a huge solution that we see coming. I've been told the electric attempts have not worked too well. But I think for the short term, it's going to be purchasing of carbon credits and offsets. That's going to be getting most of the companies to where they need to be. And then I think the new buildings that are coming online, I think will be efficient and hitting the targets that they need. But I think in the short term, it'll be purchasing of carbon credits and offsets.
Could it also be a change? And so one of the things that with a conversation with Noah I had last week was that they slowed down the shipping lanes just a little bit. It did two things. It saved whale strikes, which was pretty cool, saving gray whales from dying. Nobody's going to argue against that. But then the shipping companies actually loved it because it saved them a lot of fuel, and it only cost them an extra 10 minutes when they were going to sit in the port harbor anyway. So maybe there's an opportunity to reduce the amount of emissions by changing the shipping practices. Is that something that the industry is looking at, and like different opportunities to build on success stories?
I think with AI, you're going to be able to get a ton of optimization in terms of how how you get things through ports, through gates, routes that can be more efficient. I think absolutely. I can't speak specifically to sort of what's happening in the industry to affect that change, but yeah, I think absolutely that'll be a lever in how we reduce the overall footprint.
For us, it's kind of a mixed bag for regulation. So most of our activity up to this point has been focused around the EU and also the Asia Pacific regions for a couple of reasons. So if it's digital assets related, the EU and AP have significantly more detailed and clear frameworks for how digital assets are treated. The US has been a little iffy on digital assets. I mean, there's been a lot of news about that. Are they securities? Are they not? Will various things cause various headaches for us? Those have been sort of unclear. So in some ways, we've stayed away from the US for that reason. That said, though, I mean, the White House did release a series of guidelines around carbon credit integrity in the last year that we've pointed to quite a bit in a number of our discussions. I think that's actually, we've seen galvanize a certain amount of attention from banks around carbon credits, and getting back to that, golden question of how we can actually trust the data that's being compiled and possible assets that we're creating out of it. Another area that is relevant, I think, to this is a lot of the supply chains that we've looked at, a lot of the sourcing begins in AP and in some cases LAC. So for those reasons, I mean, we've looked at those regions as well. If you're looking to gather robust data around the sourcing of supply chains, a lot of that's, not necessarily starting in the US or the EU, at least from the supply chains that we've been looking at. So by necessity, I mean, we've been looking at a number of those regions for that reason. But I think the digital assets piece is tricky, right? And I think that in the coming years, the US will be more clear on it. I think a lot of indications that the winds are going to blow that way, no matter how the election turns. But for now, I mean, it has been challenging to work in any regions where it's not clear what a digital asset is or how a digital asset we might create out of that data would be treated.
And I think that a big part of that too is looking at the integrity of carbon reporting. And I know that the EU is really demanding that of companies, and that's forcing any company that's also doing business. If you're a US based business, but you're doing work in Europe, you would also have to follow the same requirements. But then as we're looking forward to that carbon reporting, is there a way to find more clarity through RFID tags or payment processing? The infrastructure around that.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And I think more and more supply chains have been moving towards those kinds of tracing, right? I mean, even 4 or 5 years ago, we were looking at tracing food products for World Wildlife Fund. And in Brazil, they were already setting up RFID tags on cow ears. I think that's pretty standard in the US now. In some cases, it's harder, right? It depends what you're gathering and what you're tracking. I know that Triangle has a number of solutions around IoT traceability for carbon credit development as well. But I think that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's a major component to this, right? And it's part of Mastercard's larger strategy as well. I mean, IoT is a major area that's growing exponentially every year. More devices are coming online. More devices are able to talk to each other every year. We envision devices being able to transact possibly autonomously with each other in the future. Maybe if a device can guarantee the integrity, some elements of integrity, maybe you can have a payment that's programmed to trigger just based on that. Those are the types of things we're looking at. But yeah, I mean, the technology is there, right? It's more about getting that technology implemented and getting actors who may not be incentivized fully to play fairly to implement that technology in a way that's not taking advantage of scenarios. I know in Brazil, at least part of the reason that they have the RFID tags now is because there was a lot of essentially smuggling or cows that were being brought into supply chains from non-sustainable herds and areas that deforested lands, and they were being snuck into supply chains somewhere along the line, and then it was kind of defeating the purpose of trying to ensure that your cows were from sustainable land. So there's a lot of things to suss out there, but generally, yeah, I mean, the technology is there. It's really just about getting the technology implemented correctly and trustably.
Yeah, I want to double down on that. So in the manufacturing component of the supply chain, and no matter where you are, manufacturers are really struggling with the deployment and integration of the technology. So technology's out there, but people just don't have the skill sets. I mean, it's bad enough that, we lost just a huge workforce in the Great Resignation and, the baby boomers now retiring, and not enough skills and training facilities for, journeymen to be put back into the industrial sector. But people don't know how to work in the digital world. So how they can connect all these systems is absolutely a huge gap. And yes, companies like Triangle and companies like Turtle can really do that system integration. It's a rich environment, but also it's one that really prevents the digital capability of these manufacturers to comply with the regulatory requirements. Like everyone has been saying here, without the data, you really can't do anything. So it's a huge struggle. I mean, there's research out there from the IDC that says, 60% of the manufacturers out there don't know how to system integrate all these things. And when you go into a factory or a supply chain, you'll see hundreds, if not thousands of different devices out there that are giving off telemetry. And to pull that data into a repository to be able to do ML or AI or digital twin is critical, but no one's doing it. If not, I shouldn't say no one, but it's a huge gap. So system integration is absolutely key.
Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback on that as well. While we're seeing certain companies that are, putting sails on their cargo ships and trying very innovative methods, we've in a very small context of Bermuda, we've relaunched the Bermuda International Shipping Association to try to apply pressure so that people know what their colleagues are doing. I think there's some opportunities with the global minimum tax treaties where countries like Bermuda and governments like Bermuda, and this is me speaking, can put levers in place to say, if you achieve these climate goals, you can get a reduction or a rebate on your minimum tax that, you moved to Bermuda probably in part for a zero tax opportunity, and now you're being hit by something that the OECD has set on from on a high. can we help you achieve these climate goals and reduce this new tax burden that you're going to have? So I think that the finance and the economics are really going to drive the adoption and the change in behaviors. And so we're trying to look at very creative ways to influence and encourage our partners to move faster.
And yeah, the real goal here is to get better scope 3 data and understand what it looks like. Tags help, no question there. But in the supply chain, tag is only going to go from one supplier to the next, and then it's going to most likely be transformed, ripped off, changed into something else. So all of a sudden you've got that one journey, so I can gather that amount of emissions data that between one journey and another. What happens for the next? So the way that we're approaching this is direct engagement with suppliers all the way up the supply chain as far as you can go. Today, that almost feels like science fiction. There's very few companies that can do that. But tomorrow, with regulation that we've been talking about and just the way the industry is going, it will be more and more necessary. And then networks have grown exponentially. If you think about social networks, business networks, et cetera, if you can plug all of these, disparate manufacturers into one network and they can plug in one time through standards bodies, whatever else that might be as well, you're going to actually have a chance of getting the scope 3 data. When we think of scope 3 today, we're often talking about the shipment. If you look between the tier, finished goods supplier and where the goods lands, that is like the tip of the iceberg. It's really the 80% underneath that in a lot of industries where the real scope 3 emissions are kind of coming into making your product. So I don't see a really clear path forward in that unless you're doing direct engagement with those suppliers across the way.
And a real good standard that covers 16 different industries around the world is the ISA 62440 system for integration. Standard's great. But it's a matter of executing on that standard, right? So that's the difficult challenge.
And what role does AI play in these integrations moving forward?
Wow, that's a really good question. I never.
Do you want to get ChatGPT out?
So far, everyone's talking about AI as the sizzle on the steak and not the steak, right? So that's a really good application in trying to solve the problem. But at the end of the day, there's still a skills gap. So I think that's going to be important. I think maybe what it would do is just. So Microsoft coined the term co-pilot, maybe not, but they seem to be using it a lot. So, AI could serve as a skills gap completion, right, for people to help them with doing the system integration. That's just one thought.
Yeah, Microsoft was at the National Sustainability Society's first conference a couple weeks ago at the University of Washington. And that was their idea behind Copilot, was like, literally, it is your Copilot, this AI tool. Because like even when you're in your phone and you search something, it comes in with like the set of answers. It's kind of like the enterprise computer for any tech nerds.
Yeah.
So we're building products today. So we're talking about data. We need the data. So we're using LLMs today. So instead of saying, give us your data, it needs to be in exactly this format, or you need to use an API, just run a report that you already have in your existing system. We can just import it. We'll probably be able to figure out what the fields are just by looking at the headers, maybe have a human adjust it a little bit, but just make it easier to input that data. So it's not today, it's a huge ask to integrate with the supplier. But if tomorrow it is upload a report, we'll figure out where the data is. Just give us the information. It makes it a lot easier. So that's like one very practical use of AI that is a little less sizzle and a little more steak. Yeah,
I think another one. I mean, Mastercard more generally, one of our big AI use cases is fraud detection. And that's sort of outside of supply chain, just for general transactions. I mean, if you have the kind of data that we have, you can look at, where are you most likely to see issues, where are you most likely to see fraud, what factors can we, plug into an LLM, and then that LLM can search and across, the vast amount of data we have to find potential fraud. So I think applying that to supply chain, right, there's a lot of potential points of failure, right? I think that's something that we've been talking about, how can you trust data from points A, B, C, and D? If you're talking about something like, kind of a morbid example, but if you're talking about something like a meat product that's coming out of an animal and that's maybe going to multiple different locations, maybe multiple animals are going into those locations, at a certain point, there is a certain level of trust that's required at various points in a supply chain that, technology like sensors on their own are going to have trouble tracking. So how do you trust that, right? And that comes down to things like credentialing bodies, standards, but also potentially AI. I mean, you might be able to use AI-based services to detect where fraud has occurred or where fraud is most likely to occur. I think that's something that's going to be, very important, most likely within, supply chains in the coming future.
Yeah, not to put in a plug, but shameless plug, but Cisco has been using AI for exactly that, detecting the source for many years now, right? I mean, we connect 80% of the world's internet connectivity systems. So they have those eyes to be able to do that detection. And I think that's critical so that you understand the source, right? So that you can limit damage.
To build on Darren's baseball announcement, I'm gonna throw a little bit of a curveball at you, like COVID did with all of us 4 years ago. Literally, shipping, manufacturing, logistics, and retail were all affected by the pandemic. With the evolution of technology that we've had in the last 4 years, specifically with AI and all the other data tracking, are we better positioned to not have that level of impact going forward?
I think there's a lot, I think, you know, political will and human nature comes into this in a huge way.
Yeah.
You know, so I think there were things that happened during COVID, vessels that got stranded, goods that weren't allowed to be brought into port that didn't have anything to do with technology. So I say, you know, my first response was yes, absolutely, but I think people get in the way of things, wars happen, and people have to adjust and really pivot on their business model. So I want to say yes, but I'm really hesitant to.
So the cop-out answer is with AI, we may have a better ability to detect and handle pandemics in the future. So it may, you know, make less of an impact from something like COVID. But then so many things that happened because of COVID were very atypical, right, and hard to predict. And if something like COVID were to happen again, it's hard to say if that would be the response again. But also, for example, a lot of factories were emptied out for a while. People weren't, like that was causing a major issue in supply chains as well. And a lot of supply chain gathering, especially sourcing, I mean, there is still a very human touch component there that's, you know, maybe if they're, you know, the Optimus robots are a thing one day, maybe that then you can talk about that. But for the foreseeable future, assuming that something played out like COVID again, you would have, for AI to address it, you'd have to hope that we could just address it better through AI-based technology, like detecting it or handling it that way. But I don't think we've gotten to the point yet where supply chains don't have that human requirement yet.
We run a logistics platform. During COVID, everything went sideways. We have predictive ETA products that can better predict ETAs than what your carriers give you. But when you throw something like a pandemic, machine learning doesn't work when the machine's never seen what it needs to learn. So it really is, you need the human element, and you just need to be realistic. Every like if you have a just kind of a black swan event, everyone is slightly different. There's very few like learnings that you can glean from this. But when you start looking at them holistically, and you can start explaining, well, this is a black swan event. When you've seen trend times go like this, follow that trend down. That's where we start to actually learn a little bit more. But this is a super complicated problem, and just back to Noah's point, like it really needs a human touch in a lot of cases here.
Yeah, I know that the biggest investment in following the pandemic was supply chain forecasting and supply chain automation and AI in supply chain management. So that has to have a difference. It has to make it a difference in the future, just having that visibility.
And digital twins have really come in as a key role in that space, haven't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly in product knowledge in terms of components and supplying, components for finished good, the digital twin is absolutely going to be key for, like I said, the skills gap, and also where are you going to source the next component part? Substituting parts was a thing for some manufacturers, but sourcing it was difficult. So there's no visibility into the supply chain beyond your dedicated suppliers. A lot of manufacturers like to go with their trusted vendors, which is great. But in a pinch, what are you going to do when you don't have that available to you, right? They may have to go outsource that somewhere else. And it might be out there, but having that knowledge, from what you have as a core digital twin is key.
That's that again, that same point that you kind of hit on here, which is you can't just, if you're just looking at a shipment between 2 points or your supply chain between 2 points, you're not going to get nearly the visibility if you start actually understanding, well, where is my third tier of the supply chain, my second tier? So when you find those kind of lags, especially during, a black swan event like COVID, you really get much better data. So you're spot on.
Yeah,
I think we're gonna see more. We're gonna blow through the 1.5 degree target, and so I think in the next 30 years, these black swan events are going to be not black swan events, right? So we need to get good at this really quickly, and we need to figure out how to integrate it globally. Otherwise, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see something similar happen, or some huge global crisis is coming like very, very soon. And if we're not ready for this as a global supply chain, we're going to be in big trouble.
Sounds like Noah is saying AI is going to help mitigate those black swan events.
I mean, potentially, I've seen some thought leadership around that. I know that's something that people have been talking about. I think that seems like a standard case for LLMs, that maybe they can detect things that we haven't been able to up to this point. So, I mean, ideally, yeah, well, we will be better prepared, but remains to be seen based on the event.
And speaking of the human component, does anybody in the audience have a question?
Kevin, specifically in the shipping industry, we've seen onboard carbon capture. I don't know if it's been adopted yet, but I'm just wondering, is that perhaps a solution for BSMA?
Yes, yeah. So we have one of our clients is actively doing that today. They're part of a group, and the CEO has just made a decision to go all in on the decarbonization of his fleet, and so they're leading the way. But we have not seen adoption across even their group of companies, much less alone the entire industry. So right now, I'm using my soft skills to try to influence this and just provide visibility to how they're doing it, what technology they're using. We brought Darren down to Bermuda last month to give a talk on how the industry's evolving and what technology are being deployed to really improve things. So I think it's very early stage, the carbon capture technology, and I think some people are on the sidelines waiting to see sort of if they're actually the technology is ready and what impact it has on these targets that they need to all meet. But I'm fairly enthusiastic when you see some of the new technologies coming online.
Thank you. But Kevin, what's your view on green ammonia?
On
Green ammonia.
It's a bit early, I think. I think in order for the companies to adopt that and retrofit their vessels is a challenge. I think a lot of these solutions are good on paper, but the investment needed to actually deploy that in real time is really challenging. So yeah, I think it's still a little bit early, in my opinion.
Or on supply chain readiness, should there be a pandemic? I'm Santosh Shannon with the Sun Circle, and I'm in sustainable supply chain. Kevin, specifically for you, the last known statistic post-pandemic is that there's 18-month backlog in LA for shipping containers to dock. What are you seeing in Bermuda, and what are the governments doing to help?
In Bermuda, our fear is just that the ship doesn't get seen on the horizon, and then we don't have any water to drink. The downstream effect of these supply chain issues in the US is scary for us. If things get delayed coming into port in the US, then they don't make it to small island states. So what we're doing on the ground is trying to be more self-sufficient, looking to grow food locally, looking to have water solutions embedded locally. And I was at a Caribbean Energy Roundtable yesterday, and this is a concern across the entire region. We're just not capable of existing on our own. We don't have a sustainable society, and COVID exposed that in a big way. So I don't have an answer, but I know it's at the top of mind of all of the leaders throughout the entire region.
Maybe it's the soil.
Yeah. Speaking on that, as a VC, I'm seeing a lot of companies approach me with atmospheric water capture. Is that one of the technologies that you're exploring for being able to be self-sufficient?
Not in Bermuda. No, that's not one. I mean, and we'll go slightly off piece, but we're looking at floating solar. The government are looking at wave. I'm not quite convinced. So wind doesn't work in Bermuda, but in the Caribbean it does. So those are some of the, I think the floating solar is a big one that I like, without steel, because the salt content kind of kills that business model. So I think every island, every part of the world, and every ocean is going to be a completely different solution. And the government want to move our port from where it is today to another location, and that's the opportunity that we have to build a smart port in the island. So I think the problem is finance and capital. If you're in China, if you're the US, if you're a European port or city, it's an attractive investment opportunity. You're a 60,000 person island. No one's even thinking about you, and then you don't really, your economics don't really work either. So we're looking at as a region, how can we utilize, the fact that we make waste, how can we convert that into hydrogen, maybe supply the cruise industry. So it's very early stage though, these discussions, and I could use any help in the room to build solutions, to bring technology solutions and to bring capital to some of the smaller ports.
Kevin, quick question following up on that. So they mentioned atmospheric water, right? Is that something that you guys haven't considered or you looked at and decided not to go that route?
In Bermuda, they haven't considered it. The folks that are looking at it are the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Science, BIOS. And so that's the organization that's really providing the data and the expertise on the ground, that's informing the politicians and the decision makers on what we should be looking at. And so that's really sort of informing us on where we go. I would say the Ministry of Home Affairs has just completed our first climate study of the island. So it's a data issue, right? So we don't even know where we're starting from. We can't measure and hold ourselves accountable for any changes. So that's going to cabinet last month. We'll get some sort of public opinion in Q1 next year.
Have you looked into any sort of supply partnerships? Because right now, all eyes on Caribbean islands with COVID, changing China's dynamics and a viable supply partner. Bermuda, I've explored DR, Jamaica. There's a lot of financing into these islands. Has Bermuda been a part of the larger Caribbean Islands initiative?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, thankfully, we are fairly advanced on our operations and our compliance regimes. So a lot of the Caribbean islands will send delegations to Bermuda to investigate how are we doing things, why is capital safe, and then we have the insurance industry that wraps around most of the industry. So whether it's from shipping to finance, you have the risk mitigation folks in the room. So I think the final piece that we're trying to figure out is on the policy side, on the financing is, similar to insurance, you have Solvency II, where Bermuda's kind of able to insure and reinsure Europe and the US. We're looking to do the same thing on climate finance so that we can provide an offshore solution for impact investment around the world. So that's the role we typically try to play. And then I'd say we follow on actual sort of implementation of new technology after that.
One more.
Hey, Mike. All those questions are fantastic and they're really sort of elaborate and detailed. As the person in the room that is representing a very conservative accounting organization, I'm going to make it a little bit boring. And there's two questions. Carlos, to give Kevin a bit of a break. Really interested to understand how Cisco Systems, as in the manufacturing process, is leaning on its scope 3 vendors and suppliers to really decarbonize your own value chain and what actions you've taken there. I'm hoping you can share some stories there. And then, Kevin, I'd love to come to you if I have the time to talk about CBAM and its impact on the shipping industry. It doesn't directly impact, but it means if goods are getting stopped at the border or ships are being impounded. So there's a risk there too. So I'd love to start with Carlos, then come to you, Kevin.
Yeah, so we have had a long time sustainability program in place with our vendors for Scope 3. We are a contract manufacturing company, so we don't own our own assets. But what we do is we require all those contract manufacturers to put in place systems that are going to meet our Scope 3 requirements. And also our packaging is all around a life cycle, recycle kind of a program. And we've also branded our products so that many of them are returnable to us so that we can recycle them on behalf of the clients because they do have a life cycle associated with it. And then specifically for our offerings and our solutions, we're actually not demanding anything of our vendors. We're actually putting our own technology in to help with the sustainability goals of our clients. So for example, we have proprietary silicone that goes into our Catalyst product line inside a data center. And this is particularly important now as the AI boom is going to be, is happening as we speak. Generative AI requires a lot more GPU functionality, and the silicone that we provide for our infrastructure in the data center can reduce the overall energy consumption by an order of magnitude. So we're actually not requiring it of it, we're actually delivering it and offering it to the marketplace.
It's interesting just to add on that point. That's what I'm seeing, being in the industry and consulting on this stuff. That's what I'm starting to see is the large users of their scope 3, when and where economically possible, are starting to invest back in to that value chain and give their customer or their suppliers a bit of a leg up. But it really is an economic sense maker, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act. There's opportunities to, provide yourself with some tax credits and investments.
Yeah, for sure.
In decarbonisation of your value chain.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
Kevin, can I
Can
get?
you just repeat the question one more time? Just
Yeah, for you. So carbon border adjustment mechanism. I had a lot of clients that are punched in the face with this, right? Mainly in, how do I say it in American? Aluminium, where I'm from. So aluminum, we have a lot of aluminum clients, and they keep coming to us saying, CBAM, we don't understand it. It's cradle to gate, not cradle to grave. We need to measure our emissions, but it's not GHG protocol. It's a completely different thing. Thank God the Europeans are being a bit more complicated. But it doesn't take into account emissions of shipping. Yet, if you're transporting aluminum into a European port and you do not meet the carbon accounting requirements, and in 2 years' time, you do not pay the fee required, well, that ship's going to get impounded.
Yeah.
So how's the shipping industry working with its key, those 6 categories of materials to make sure that you're future-proofing yourself?
I think right now, not well. I think the point that a lot of folks that aren't close enough to Europe don't quite appreciate is that they're going to get caught regardless. And, I've been talking to folks in the Middle East about this recently, and I just getting them to kind of start to pay attention, because it doesn't matter if they're not directly impacted. They're going to get caught out on that scope 2, scope 3 piece. And I think it's just awareness and education. The way we're addressing it is we're revitalizing this industry association just so they get everyone in the same room and talk about these things and give examples of what's happening. And then you start to get the intersection of ideas where the insurers are talking to the manufacturers and they're talking to the folks that are running the fleets. So I think it's still very early. I think, 30% of the industry are going to get caught out on this, and they're not really going to know why. But it's going to take about 5 years, I think, for this thing to filter down throughout the rest of the global supply chain.
And you capture it from both sides, because you're the shipping side, but then Bermuda's also insurance.
Exactly.
I'd love to talk to you afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's why we bring Darren down, because he when we brought him down, the interest from the entire industry was palpable in the room, because they knew nothing, right? And there was maybe 2 companies in Bermuda that were putting sails on their vessels and doing the carbon capture, but the rest of them were just like, oh my God. We were very happy with the level of engagement when we were trying to educate the market.
Thank you.
So it sounds like we could use clear regulations, good, clear, concise data, and a lot more money to solve all these problems. I want to thank everybody up here. It was a good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.